My name's Kevin Barlow. I'm a Micmac person from the East Coast, now living here in Vancouver, and been working for and with my people pretty much my whole life.
Great. So the first thing I want to ask about is the history of your people and culture.
I think, what we're looking at here is, you know, um, Europeans arrived in North America quite a long time ago. Um, the Micmacs, for example, have a treaty with the Vatican that dates back to 1610. So that's like 400 and some years ago. And so we're talking a long period of time where there's been exposure to a different culture. And that history has not been a good one, where people have been displaced. Roles within our societies have changed. You know, when people went into residential schools, they had a lot of negative experiences there, very deep traumatic wounds. And these residential schools were meant to change culture. They were meant to take the Indian out of the Indian. And so that kind of situation has led to one loss after another, where our economies changed. We were no longer self-reliant. We became dependent on government. We weren't able to provide for ourselves. We no longer had a land base, and our languages took a beating. A lot of people died from illness and disease, and so all these things have really laid an extended groundwork for some major issues that need to be dealt with today.
Can you describe the terms multi-generational trauma or accumulative loss?
Yeah, what multi-generational trauma is like. Let's say my grandparents went to residential schools, and then they were wounded when they were in there, emotionally, psychologically, that type of thing. They come out, and then their children end up going into residential schools, and it's the same thing. And because these are institutions, and you couldn't say no, you were forced to go. You know, each generation has carried on those kind of wounds, and it shut down people where they weren't able to show love in some cases. They weren't. They came back to communities where they didn't find the resources to deal with, some things like that we weren't familiar with dealing with, like sexual abuse and that type of thing. And so after so many generations, these cumulative losses of losing your place within the community. Like, for example, women used to be treated in a very good light. They were the people that brought forth life, but then you saw many being beaten by their husbands. And those were kind of the wounds that came out and started creating more losses. People lost their language, lost their culture, lost their ceremonies, and then they end up just keeping that going for such a long time that after a while, a darkness sets in and people don't know how to deal with it anymore.
Great. And then we were talking about kind of a mismatch of goals between the mainstream European culture here in Canada and the Aboriginal culture.
Yeah, I think, the backdrop to that is that mainstream society has always wanted to change Native people to be, taxpayers and part of the body politic and, that type of thing. Whereas in our communities, our goals were family-based cultures, and a lot of times what we really want to do is stay within our families, our home communities, and not necessarily go out and get an education, that type of thing. There was like a society there that we were trying to stay within, and so, sometimes, these differences between mainstream society and our communities resulted in sort of clashes, and that's why in some cases you saw, like, for example, social workers coming in and taking Native children out of their homes and placing them into non-Native homes, and it just created lots of different conflicts and challenges, and so some of our people, end up working sort of within our system to move up the ladder. An example would be, a young girl who becomes pregnant and has 2 or 3 children. That's her that's her rite of passage in today's society, because then she gets on a housing list and she might get more money on welfare and child tax and GST and all those kind of things, family allowance. And so, in an impoverished society, people end up turning to these kind of things to make ends meet, and so that becomes the norm in the community. Whereas in other mainstream society, the general approach is, you want to be stable, have an education, married, and then bring your children into the world so that you can provide for them. But it's different in our communities, where a lot of times it's people that are moving up the ladder that way by bringing in children into the world.
And you'd also mentioned the prison system. That's
yeah, I think because some of these wounds have gone on in our communities, and some people have turned to alcohol and drugs, or some have used violence as a way of expressing themselves because they don't know how to resolve conflict in a more gentler way. The people that are wounded, hurt other people. And then if they get involved in the prison system, sometimes that's a way where they can find community, because there's native brotherhoods within the systems that, they end up, almost becoming, finding community within the prison system. And that's where they are with other people that are just like them, And so, these sort of pockets, like birds of a feather stick together, are ways that, people gravitate, to kind of, when they're feeling marginalized from communities. It's just like youth who get involved in the gang system. They may not feel love at home or whatever, and I'm not talking everybody, I'm just talking in some cases. So you might have youth that, end up being groomed to join a gang and sell drugs and make $1,000 in a day, when they don't have, an education, or they can't make more than minimum wage. And so it's a matter of economics. If you can make $1,000 a day and have the latest runners and clothes and iPhones and everything else, so be it, if it's done through an illegal way, And that's the thing; these things become normalized after a while, because you see your peers doing it, and then it becomes more acceptable.
Right. So, all that considering, what do you think some of the solutions are? You had mentioned moving towards an asset model.
Yeah, I truly believe that what's going on now in a lot of Aboriginal communities is the approach of an asset-based model, where what we're trying to do is point out the things that are going right in our communities, instead of saying you're 10 times at risk for heart disease, you're 5 times at risk for diabetes, you're this time amount for HIV or whatever have you, because those negative messages that come along that way, sometimes people give up and they say, well, if I'm at risk for everything, like why should I try and change my life, Whereas if we start to say that, there's things that are working in our community, there's people that still speak our language, there are still ceremonies that are being done, people can go to powwows and, be part of that circle of life, and we can reinforce the things that work within our families, because, as I mentioned earlier, we're family-based cultures, and that extended family system can actually work to help